Welcome back to the garage. In this video, we're going to be attempting to rebuild the steering rack mechanism on Project Unintended Spending, the 1987 Audi 5000 CS Quattro that I bought with a ton of issues. If you're just now joining the series, be sure to check the link in the description below to see the entire project from start to now. Let's check out the condition of the steering rack. Here it is in its filthy, dirty glory. This steering rack was a bear to remove from the car. If you're curious how I did that, be sure to check the previous video, episode 7. But we are having to rebuild this assembly, and the primary reason for that is you can't purchase this new or remanufactured anymore. It's totally obsolete, at least in the United States, so I've had to resort to finding a rebuild kit, which was hard enough to find itself since that part is obsolete as well. But luckily I found a rebuild kit and can now attempt to rebuild this fairly complex mechanism. Now, this steering rack is unique compared to a lot of other cars where the sliding portion is in the middle of it instead of on the outer ends. Your tie rods actually mount to the middle of this thing. And ultimately, when this boot that kind of encloses the sliding mechanism starts to fail, dirt gets in and it destroys the seals, and ultimately you're ending up with a large power steering fluid leak. That's what this car was exhibiting. It was just drenching the ground beneath it with power steering fluid. Now, this reason was twofold, as I discussed in the previous video. One is that the boot is clearly ripped and dirt was getting in, ruining those seals. But secondarily, the strut mount bearings were seized, and basically this rack was having to exert 4 times the additional effort to try and turn the front wheels, which obviously puts additional pressure on the entire hydraulic system and can lead to premature seal blowing out as well. So this rack has seen hell and back, and we're trying to give it a new lease on life. So the first thing I want to do with this steering rack is just give it a good degreasing, at least the exterior parts, before I start disassembling it. So I'm going to do that and I'll be right back. So I'm sure that doesn't look a whole lot cleaner, but it is slightly less greasy. Now I can start taking things apart. Now again, I've never done this before, so I'm not going to talk through this because I'm going to be figuring it out as I go. So let's get to it. You can see just how much dirt has gotten inside there. It's no wonder the seals and O-rings have blown out. And there we are, we've reached the final disassembly point, at least for the most part. I still have to remove some O-rings, but at this stage is where I can start cleaning the parts and repainting them. I'm not gonna get that on video, but I guarantee you things are gonna look a lot better here very soon. Now you probably noticed that I used this press to get some components out, and I just bought this 12-ton shop press from Harbor Freight, and it is already paying dividends. I was getting tired of not being able to do a few pretty major jobs just because I didn't have a good, consistent way to press things in and out. So now I can always press things in and out properly with this press. That means wheel bearings and press fit assemblies like in that steering gear we just saw. This also means I can install seals a little bit more securely than simply hammering it in with a socket. So I'm very excited about this new tool in the shop. You'll see it more in future videos for sure. So overall, I'm impressed by the condition of all of the hard parts. Everything looks like it is salvageable. There was one component I wasn't quite sure about, and it was this, looks like kind of a plastic bushing that isolates the rack inside of this main tube. And it looks like it still fits well. So I couldn't even find a new one of those, so I'm glad it's still serviceable. And I believe the kit covers all of the O-rings and replaceable fittings that I need to think about, such as the seals and this kind of guide seal in there. It's like a nylon piece. There's lots of pieces in this kit. We'll go over it in a second, but I'm going to get to cleaning this up and refinishing it. And here we are. Everything is cleaned up, degreased, degridded, de-dirted, and refinished / repainted. And I think that's a pretty good result overall. This did take between 4 and 5 hours to do, but it's worth spending the time, so it actually looks like it did something to the steering rack when it goes back in. Every little part has been degreased, and all relevant parts have been repainted, so at least it looks fresh once again. I was able to clean up this bushing. There's a little bit of wear in it, but nothing too crazy. Got all of the dirt and like sand that had gotten into the steering rack. This poor steering rack had seen it all, but even kind of repainted the bolt heads just so it looks fresh when it goes back into the car. I'm happy to say the bearing on this rotary valve is still in good shape. Now let's go over to the bench and see the new parts we're going to be fitting to this rack. Here are all the parts to thoroughly rebuild this steering rack. And starting off with the most important part of all, and that is the steering rack rebuild kit. And what this consists of is basically a lot of O-rings and various one-time use pieces of hardware like these bolts and this nut, various sealing washers for the pressure lines along the steering rack body. So it's definitely necessary to have a kit like this. Unfortunately, these are extremely hard to find now. This one on eBay was the only thing I could find, and thankfully it was a reasonable price at about $60, but I don't know where you can get these outside of there. As you can tell, the packaging it came in says this is very much West Germany made, and that's okay because these are still in very good condition. They've been in the bag all these years. Now, there is one concern I have with this rebuild kit, or rather not necessarily concerned with the kit, but the concern with the rack I just disassembled, and that's that the kit has two parts that I did not remove from the steering rack. One is this plastic washer looking thing, and another one is this like rubbery bushing looking thing. And I don't really know what these are, but I have gone to the factory service manual and looking at this parts diagram, there's this damper ring right here, which certainly wasn't there when I disassembled the rack. And there's also this call out for a thrust ring, which I assume is what that plastic ring is. So when we go to reassemble this, we'll have to install those parts if they fit. It's really surprising a steering rack rebuilt by ZF, which is the original part manufacturer, wouldn't have installed these when doing the rebuild. Very curious that. Also included in this rebuild kit is the most critical seal of all, and it's within this separate bag. It's a little Teflon O-ring looking thing, and it slides on the main steering rack shaft. This requires a special tool to install. I don't have the correct factory service tool, but after hours of thinking about how I will accomplish this, I think I can use this freebie pin to get us across the finish line. We will see, and we'll check back in once we're doing that specific job. And then over here we have a steering rack rebuild grease. I don't know what kind of grease this really is. They sell it in this small tube. It is an Audi Volkswagen part, and this is what's recommended in the service manual, so we'll use that when reassembling. Then we have 2 quarts of CHF 11S power steering fluid. We will be putting this throughout the entire hydraulic system on the car, flushing out all the old stuff and filling it up with this. I also have gotten a little syringe that I've filled up. As you can see, the fluid's green. We'll use this when reassembling the rack to help lubricate all the parts. And then we have a brand new steering rack boot made by Limforder. Very high quality, supple rubber part. And it comes with new ear band clamps like this. And it may be strange that I'm calling that out, but surprisingly, a lot of the aftermarket boots available, they don't come with band clamps, or they come with zip ties, which is totally inadequate for this kind of job. And you'd be surprised how difficult it is to find band clamps of this size to do this job if it doesn't come with the boot. So if you're gonna do this, be sure to seek out one of these Limforder units. All right, so that's an overview of all the parts. Let's go ahead and get started putting this thing back together. And now let's talk about the most critical part of the reassembly process, and that is these specific parts right here. They even come in their own little baggie in the rebuild kit. So right here is what's in this little baggie, and this is what I would call a seal head. And this is the most common culprit of a leaking steering rack. And let me show you why. If you can see this little bluish green insert, this is a Teflon seal, and this seal goes along this very smooth shaft right here. And the job of this seal is to seal the high pressure side of the steering rack from getting fluid into the no pressure or no fluid side of the rack, meaning just the rack and pinion and this bushing and grease side of things. So when you get a power steering leak, it's because this seal has started to enlarge in, it's got dirt trapped in it, and it's allowing fluid past, and now it's getting into the boot area and leaking out. So it's critical that this seal gets replaced when you're doing this. Now, the extra bit of difficulty with this seal is that it doesn't simply just fit over the top of this shaft like you might expect. This is where a special tool needs to be made, like a conical shape, so you can actually slip this over the top. If you pull out the seal by itself like here and try to slip it over the top of this shaft, you will not be able to do it. First of all, these are very sharp edges. And second of all, the seal has to be expanded evenly. And you're not going to be able to do that by trying to force it on there. If you try to force it on there, it will get damaged and you will have a power steering leak just like you had before. And that's why so many of these rebuilt steering racks leak after they've been rebuilt, because this seal was not installed properly. So I don't have the VW Audi special tools for installing this seal head and slipping this over the top of the shaft. So I'm going to have to get creative here. So let's talk about the first step in all of this. So this seal right here is actually a mixture of various O-rings. And what I'm going to do is just pull off the external O-ring. This is a very stiff O-ring because it has to seal all the pressure of the fluid chamber against the sliding rack portion. So the step I want to do this is actually install this in the body of the steering rack first, and see if we can see down in there. There's place for this O-ring to seat in there. And what I'm going to do is kind of just drop this in there and seat it with a very long screwdriver. Okay, so that O-ring is now seated. It will give you a false positive on being seated, so you have to make sure it's really pushed in there. It does take effort. I didn't get it on camera because I couldn't see what I was doing, but you do have to use a long screwdriver like this to actually use as pushing it in around the circumference. And then I use some 3/8 ratchet extensions like this to hold it into the bottom. Once I got the bottom pushed in, I held it in place with this on the bottom, and then I used the screwdriver to go around the circumference and actually press it into its seat there. So the next step technically is pressing this into place into that O-ring inside of the tube. So this is an assembly. It's this metal ring that houses an O-ring and that Teflon seal. Now the challenge of all this is the rod has to be able to pass through this ring once it's inside of the tube. And if you don't have a tool to slip this over the top, then all this work is for nothing, which is where this pin comes into play. This is just a free pin I happen to have laying around. I got it at some event, and it's the cone or the tip of the pin that matters in this job. Now I can give the specs of this pin, but unfortunately it's not one you can just buy. You have to buy like a set of 250 of them or something like that. So you'll just have to basically look around your house to see if you can't find something that fits perfectly through this seal with just minimum amount of resistance. Because what you want it to be is just slightly larger than the seal. Basically you want the rearmost part of this cone to be about the same diameter or slightly larger than the shaft itself, so the seal can slip on top of it. Now you see my dilemma here is that this cone is, or where the pin would actually come out, is too small to pass this threaded portion off. So really the only part that matters of this cone is this topmost section. So what I'm going to do is just cut the end of this off so I can slide it over the top of this so I can pass the shaft through and slip the seal over the top. Now we need to basically remove the internal threads of this so it'll slip over the top of that. That inner diameter needs to be very close to the outer diameter, so we have to be very careful here with the Dremel. Okay, after working with this for a few minutes, I think I finally got it to the right size. There we go. So just to test this theory, all right, let's say that worked. Now it's time to press this into the steering rack body. You want to make sure you press it in this direction with the seal not exposed side downward. All right, now the seal head is fully seated. You can see it down in there. You can see the blue portion of the seal facing up this way. And when we look at it on this angle, now the next thing we need to do is press this piece into that. And this outer diameter actually is a press fit into the end of this tube. And how I'm going to do that is use this end barrel as my mandrel. Just slot this in there since it basically perfectly centers it. Just slide it in. And like that, we'll put it back in the press. All right, so that's pressed in. Now I just need to knock this end tube back out. All right, now we're at a point where we can actually install this rod now. First things first, we want to put our little adapter on the top. And we want to lubricate this very well, as well as the seal. Also want to make sure the bushing is properly lubricated with the grease. I want to make sure this damper bushing is in place. Again, this wasn't there when I took it apart, but it does fit in right here. There we go. It has passed the seal. Now I need to fish that tool off the end. So I've decided that this thrust ring is not used on the steering rack at all, even though the service manual says that it should fit right here after this particular O-ring. But just check this out. There is absolutely no way that will fit inside of the body of the steering rack. That is absolutely too thick. So there must have been a different cylinder tube that was used at some point, and I've got the one that does not use this thrust ring. I've already tried inserting this into the body, and there's no way. I've also tried each one of these other channels, and none of them have a deeper groove than that. So that's just not going to be used. It wasn't there when I took it apart, and there certainly wasn't a leak occurring from this area of the tube, so I think it's fine just to have the O-rings. Now this part, I don't know that it matters, but I've tried to put the steering rack in the middle of its throw. So I just got out a ruler and measured the center points of where the tie rods connect to the end of this sliding cylinder. And now it's even as far as the rack is concerned. But I can tell you, when I slackened off the pinch bolt where the steering shaft goes down onto this little gearbox, this flat where the clamp actually goes across was perpendicular to basically the floor of the car, and I'm trying to keep it that way, and I don't know how many revolutions it is to get centered, But I'm just going to put it on this flat and see where it ends up as I slide it across. You got fairly close. It honestly doesn't matter. You can just recenter the steering wheel once you have it in the car. And there we are, the finished result, and it does look a lot better than when we started. Definitely some guess and check, figuring out how to put this thing back together so it won't leak. And fingers crossed it truly won't leak. We won't know for a little bit until we get this all back together. But it certainly looks the part, and all of the parts went in without too much of a fight. So I'm feeling pretty good about this one. That's all we've got for this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all again in the next one.